When we think of death row, we often imagine hardened adult criminals, but in some of the most haunting chapters of American criminal justice history, children have also faced the ultimate punishment. This deep dive explores the lives and crimes of the youngest individuals ever sentenced to death in the United States. Their stories raise powerful questions about morality, maturity, and the justice system's handling of youthful offenders. Sean Sellers. State, Oklahoma. Age at crime, 16. Sean Sellers had a troubled upbringing, marked by a history of abuse, mental health issues, and a deepening fascination with Satanism. As a teenager, Sellers became involved in the occult, a factor he later claimed played a role in the murders. On the night of the first crime, Sellers, armed with a gun, entered the convenience store where Bellofato worked. After robbing the store, he shot Bellofato in the back, killing him in cold blood. After committing this murder, Sellers went on to kill his mother and stepfather a few months later. According to Sellers, he killed his mother and stepfather while they were asleep in bed. He later explained that he believed he was under the influence of Satanism at the time of the killings, describing his actions as being driven by voices he heard in his head. Sellers was arrested shortly after the murder of his parents. At trial, his defense team argued that his age, mental health, and his involvement in Satanism should be considered as mitigating factors. Sellers' mental state was a focal point of the trial, as psychiatrists testified that he suffered from depression, antisocial behavior, and likely had a dissociative disorder. Despite appeals based on his young age, 16 at the time of the murders, and mental health, Sean Sellers was executed by lethal injection on February 4, 1999. He was the first person executed in the United States for a crime committed at 16 since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Sellers' execution was particularly controversial because of his age and the mental health factors in his case. Before his execution, Sellers underwent a significant personal transformation. He converted to Christianity while on death row, and some religious groups argued that his change in faith demonstrated his rehabilitation. Still, his execution went ahead as scheduled. Sellers' final words were a mixture of remorse and faith. "I just want to say I'm sorry for everything I did, and I hope my family will forgive me. I love you all, and I know God will take care of you." His final statement was brief, but it reflected the transformation he had gone through while on death row. Sellers requested a final meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and a Coca-Cola, though it was reported that he didn't finish it. Sellers was pronounced dead at 6:03 p.m. on February 4, 1999, after being executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. Paula Cooper, State, Indiana. Age at crime, 15. Paula Cooper was only 15 years old when she committed a crime that shocked the nation. On May 14, 1985, Cooper and 3 other teenage girls planned to rob 78-year-old Ruth Pelk, a Bible teacher in Gary, Indiana. Cooper, along with her accomplices Denise Thomas, 14, Karen Corder, 16, and April Beverly, 15, went to Pelk's home under the pretense of wanting to study the Bible with her. Once inside, the girls attacked Pelkey, with Cooper taking the lead. She struck the elderly woman repeatedly and then brutally stabbed her 33 times in the chest and neck with a butcher knife. After murdering Pelka, the group stole a total of $10 in Pelk's car before fleeing the scene. The crime was particularly horrifying due to its extreme violence and the young ages of the perpetrators. Cooper was arrested shortly after and quickly confessed to the crime. She was tried as an adult, and in 1986, despite her young age, she was sentenced to death. Her sentencing made her the youngest person on death row in the United States at the time. The case gained national and international attention, sparking debates about the morality of sentencing juveniles to death. High-profile figures, including Pope John Paul II, pleaded for clemency on her behalf. During her time in prison, Cooper pursued education and rehabilitation programs, earning a degree and advocating for prison reform. After serving 27 years, she was released on June 17, 2013, at the age of 43. However, just 2 years later, in May 2015, Cooper was found dead in an apparent suicide in Indianapolis. George Stinney Jr., State, South Carolina. Age at crime 14. George Stinney Jr. was arrested in 1944 after being accused of the brutal murders of 2 young white girls, Betty June Della and Mary Emma Thames, in the small town of Alcaloo, South Carolina. The case against him was largely based on a coerced confession, and he was convicted by an all-white jury in a trial that lasted only a few hours. There was little to no evidence linking him to the crime, and his defense attorney was appointed just moments before the trial began, leaving no time to prepare an adequate defense. At the time of his execution, Stinney was only 14 years old, making him one of the youngest individuals ever sentenced to death in the United States. Stinney was executed by electric chair on June 16, 1944, just 83 days after his arrest. The execution took place despite widespread doubts about his guilt, and there were numerous appeals for clemency based on his age and the lack of solid evidence. At that time, South Carolina had not yet established a minimum age for the death penalty, allowing juveniles as young as 14 to be sentenced to death. In 2014, Stinney's case was reopened after defense attorneys filed a petition arguing that the trial had been unfair and that the confession had likely been coerced. Following a thorough review of the case and the discovery of new evidence that suggested Stinney's innocence, a South Carolina judge overturned his conviction. The judge ruled that Stinney's constitutional rights had been violated, and his conviction was vacated posthumously. Stinney did not have the opportunity to make a final statement as he was executed swiftly and unjustly. He had no final meal, as he was executed without being given that chance. Stinney was executed by electric chair on June 16, 1944, at 7:30 p.m. and was pronounced dead shortly after the execution. Douglas Christopher Thomas. State, Virginia. Age at crime 17. On November 10, 1990, in Middlesex County, Virginia, 17-year-old Douglas Christopher Thomas murdered J.B. and Kathy Wiseman, the parents of his 14-year-old girlfriend, Jessica Wiseman. The Wisemans had opposed their daughter's relationship with Thomas and had threatened to separate them. In response, Thomas and Jessica conspired to kill her parents. On the night of the murders, Thomas entered the Wiseman home through Jessica's bedroom window, proceeded to the master bedroom, and shot both J.B. and Kathy Wiseman as they slept. After the initial shooting, Kathy Wiseman, though severely injured, managed to reach Jessica's room. Jessica then urged Thomas to shoot her mother again, which he did, resulting in her death. Thomas was arrested shortly after the murders and charged with capital murder. He pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of J.B. Wiseman and not guilty to the capital murder of Kathy Wiseman. Despite being a minor, he was tried as an adult. In August 1991, a jury found him guilty on all counts and recommended a death sentence for the capital murder charge. The trial judge upheld the jury's recommendation, and Thomas was formally sentenced to death in November 1991. His appeals, including petitions for writs of habeas corpus, were unsuccessful. Douglas Christopher Thomas was executed by lethal injection on January 10, 2000, at the age of 26, after spending his entire adult life on death row. His execution drew international criticism, as executing individuals for crimes committed as juveniles is considered a violation of international human rights standards. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that executing individuals for crimes committed under the age of 18 is unconstitutional, a decision that came too late for Thomas and others executed for crimes committed as juveniles. There is no official record of Douglas Christopher Thomas's exact last words before his execution. However, it is known that Thomas did not make a public statement or last words during his execution. In some cases, inmates do not provide last words, or those statements are not released for public record. As for his last meal, it was reported that Thomas requested a meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, corn, a biscuit, and chocolate cake, which is a standard request for many inmates. The chilling nature of the crime, particularly the fact that it was committed by teenagers and that Jessica allegedly encouraged the murders of her own parents, captured national attention. While Jessica was tried and convicted in juvenile court and received a lesser sentence, Thomas was tried as an adult and ultimately sentenced to death for his role in the calculated and cold-blooded murders. Leonard Shockley. State, Georgia. Age at crime, 17.
Leonard Shockley. On a cold January morning in 1958, Leonard and Harold Shockley, two young brothers, decided to commit a robbery in Box Iron, Maryland.
On the night of April 21, 1958, Leonard Shockley and his accomplice, McGee, both teenagers, planned to rob Mildred Thomas, a woman in Savannah, Georgia. The crime unfolded with shocking brutality. Thomas was not only beaten, but also strangled with a cord during the attack. Shockley and McGee tied her up, subjected her to severe abuse, and then ransacked her home, stealing various items. The violent nature of the crime was made even more disturbing by the fact that Shockley, just 17 years old at the time, was involved. The crime, compounded by the age of the victim and Shockley's youth, became a focal point for the broader national debate on juvenile offenders and the death penalty. This case was one of the earliest that highlighted the tension between criminal justice and the execution of minors, generating widespread controversy. Shockley's legal proceedings were swift, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Despite being only 17, his defense argued that Shockley lacked the mental capacity to fully comprehend the gravity of his actions due to his age. The legal system, however, moved quickly, and Shockley was sentenced to death. The trial and its outcome became significant in the debate on whether juveniles should be eligible for the death penalty. At the time, Shockley's execution made him one of the youngest individuals to be put to death in the United States, and his case contributed to growing concerns about the fairness and ethics of executing minors. Shockley was executed on January 17, 1959 at Georgia State Prison at just 17 years old. His execution sparked significant public discourse on the ethics of the death penalty, particularly for those under the age of 18. His case became a precursor to the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Roper v. Simmons 2005, which ruled that executing minors violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Shockley's case remains a poignant example of the complexities surrounding juvenile justice and the death penalty. Sharif Cousin. State, Louisiana. Age at crime, 16. On August 27, 1995, 63-year-old Marie S. Brack was found brutally murdered in her New Orleans home. She had been stabbed multiple times, and her throat was slashed. Sharif Cousin was arrested in connection with the crime shortly afterward, and the prosecution relied heavily on his confession, which he later claimed was coerced by police. Despite the lack of physical evidence tying him to the murder, Cousin was convicted. Sharif Cousin's trial was fast-tracked, and he was convicted of first-degree murder in 1996. His confession was the main evidence against him, but over the years it was revealed that it was obtained under duress. Additionally, DNA testing excluded him as the source of the evidence found at the crime scene. Despite these revelations, Cousin was sentenced to death. In 2003, after several years of legal battles, new DNA evidence and a review of the case led to Sharif Cousin's exoneration. The DNA testing confirmed that he was not the perpetrator of the crime, and it was established that his confession had been coerced. Cousin was released from death row after spending 7 years on it. The case highlighted significant flaws in the criminal justice system, especially regarding the interrogation of minors and the use of confessions as the primary evidence in capital cases. Sharif Cousin's exoneration and release from prison in 2003 allowed him to rebuild his life after spending 7 years on death row. Cousin's story has been a part of the broader national conversation about wrongful convictions, the treatment of young offenders, and the fairness of the death penalty. Lionel Tate, State, Florida. Age at crime 12. On July 28, 1999, Lionel Tate was left alone at home with 6-year-old Tiffany Unick in their Broward County, Florida residence. Over the course of the evening, Tate claimed to have been mimicking wrestling moves he had seen on television. However, Tiffany suffered catastrophic injuries, including a fractured skull, broken ribs, and a lacerated liver. The autopsy suggested she had been beaten for a prolonged period. Despite Tate's defense that he had not intended to harm her seriously, the severity of the injuries suggested intentional and repeated abuse. Lionel Tate was initially charged with first-degree murder and tried as an adult. Prosecutors rejected a plea deal that would have seen Tate serve 3 years in a juvenile facility, insisting instead on pursuing adult charges. In 2001, at age 14, he was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. The case drew intense criticism due to the perceived harshness of sentencing a child to life in prison. In 2004, the conviction was overturned when an appellate court found that Tate had not undergone a proper mental health evaluation prior to trial. He was released after accepting a plea agreement for second-degree murder. Though Lionel Tate was released in 2004, he continued to encounter legal trouble. In 2005, he was arrested for violating his probation, and in 2006, he was convicted of armed robbery. He is currently serving a 30-year sentence. Tate's case remains a flashpoint in discussions around juvenile justice, the effects of media violence, and the appropriateness of adult sentencing for young offenders. It also contributed to growing momentum for legal reforms that emphasize rehabilitation over punishment for children in the justice system. Scott Hain, State, Oklahoma. Age at crime, 17. On the night of October 6, 1987, Scott Hain and Robert Lambert were seeking money when they encountered Michael Houghton and Laura Sanders in a Tulsa parking lot. The pair abducted the victims at gunpoint, forcing them into the trunk of their car. After robbing them, Hain and Lambert drove to a secluded area, poured gasoline over the car, and set it ablaze with Houghton and Sanders still locked inside. Witnesses described hearing screams from the trunk as the car burned. An autopsy later confirmed both victims died from a combination of smoke inhalation and burns. The crime was particularly horrific due to the method and the helplessness of the victims. Hain was arrested shortly after the crime, along with Lambert. Despite being minors, both were charged and tried as adults. Hain's trial focused heavily on the cruelty of the murders, and the jury quickly returned a guilty verdict with a recommendation for the death penalty. His defense presented mitigating evidence, including his age, alleged influence from Lambert, and claims of a difficult upbringing. But these arguments did not sway the jury or appellate courts. Over the years, Hain's case drew attention from human rights advocates and legal scholars, particularly as the movement to end juvenile executions gained momentum. However, the courts refused to grant clemency, and his sentence was ultimately carried out. Scott Hain was executed in 2003 at the age of 32 for a crime he committed at 17. His execution preceded the Roper v. Simmons decision by just 2 years. That ruling made it unconstitutional to execute offenders who were under the age of 18 at the time of their crime, effectively ending juvenile executions in the United States. Hain's case remains a notable reference point in the history of capital punishment in juvenile justice reform. Carly Madison Gregg, State, Mississippi. Age at time of crime, 14. On March 19, 2024, in Brandon, Mississippi, 14-year-old Carly Madison Gregg fatally shot her mother, 40-year-old Ashley Smiley, multiple times using a .357 Magnum revolver. Following the shooting, Gregg used her mother's phone to text her stepfather, 39-year-old Heath Smiley, attempting to lure him home. Upon his arrival, she shot him in the shoulder. He survived the attack and managed to disarm her. Additionally, Gregg invited a friend over to the house and showed her mother's lifeless body, reportedly asking if the friend was squeamish around dead bodies. Gregg was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and tampering with evidence. During the trial, her defense argued that she was experiencing a mental health crisis at the time of the crime, presenting evidence of depression, auditory hallucinations, and dissociative episodes. Despite this, on September 20, 2024, the jury found her guilty on all counts after approximately 2 hours of deliberation. She was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Following her conviction, Gregg's defense team filed a motion for a new trial, citing the discovery of new evidence that could potentially alter the outcome. However, in October 2024, a judge denied this request, stating that the new evidence was insufficient to warrant a retrial. As of March 2025, Carly Gregg remains incarcerated. She has obtained new legal representation, with attorney James Murphy now handling her case before the Mississippi Supreme Court. Gregg's case has garnered significant attention due to her young age and the severity of her crimes. It has sparked discussions about juvenile justice, mental health considerations in criminal cases, and the appropriateness of life sentences without parole for teenage offenders. The chilling accounts of America's youngest murderers condemned to death highlight a troubling chapter in the nation's criminal justice history. Though today's legal system has shifted to offer greater protections for minors, these stories remain powerful reminders of how children were once subjected to the ultimate punishment. If you found this deep dive into the youngest murderers, children on death row thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth true crime content and powerful insights into the evolving landscape of justice in America.